Ellie had waited in the hotel lobby for more than 1 hour. Jessica was late again, as always. When the security staff member approached with a strange offer, "Mr. DeLuca would like to invite you to his private suite, the penthouse on the top floor," she should have declined. She should have kept waiting for her friend. Instead, she sent a simple line, "There is something urgent. Let us reschedule," then rose and followed a stranger into the private elevator that led to the apartment under the roof. Because sometimes the wisest decisions are the most reckless ones. Where are you watching from? Share below. The Belrose Hotel lay quiet in the late autumn night of New York, in the heart of Tribeca, like an old gem tucked inside a city that never sleeps. Not crowded, not noisy, not tourists taking pictures everywhere. Only the sort of people one usually finds in glossy magazines like Forbes or in financial investigation files. The hotel was not large, fewer than 60 rooms, yet every detail spoke of rank and polish. Velvet chairs the color of wine, Italian crystal chandeliers, a gentle breath of jasmine and cedar drifting through the air like an invisible embrace. Ellie sat in one of those chairs, feeling both out of place and tired. It was close to 11:30 at night. Jessica should have arrived more than an hour earlier. The most recent message she had received came at 10:15. Only a few words, "Traffic is insane. 5 minutes out." Before that came running a bit late, order a drink. And before that, already on my way. As always, the same promises repeated until they felt worn thin. Ellie wore a deep indigo dress, the prettiest dress in her closet, the one she usually saved for special meetings. Her eyes were lined sharply following instructions from 3 YouTube tutorials she had to rewind again and again. Brown hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders. The high heels were killing her feet. She had tried her very best to look all right. And once more, she had been left to wait. She looked down at her phone for the 1001 time, then lifted her eyes to the wall clock. The bartender passed by with a sympathetic smile. "We will be closing the bar in 15 minutes. Would you like to order something? It is on us." Which meant your friend is not coming and we feel sorry for you. Ellie forced a small smile. "Thank you. I will wait a little longer." That was what she always did, wait a little longer. Wait for a friend, wait for affection, wait for priority, wait for someone to treat her as she deserved. Every time she forgave because Jess was her best friend from college, because Jess had stood by her when her mother died, because friendship required patience. Did it not? Yet tonight, sitting alone in a luxury that felt almost like a quiet mockery of her ordinariness, Ellie sensed something shifting inside. A weariness rose up. Weariness from always being the one to adjust, to yield, to text. It is fine when clearly it was not. She did not notice the man standing at a distance among the warm golden lights and the row of antique mirrors. He was watching her, and a few minutes later, he sent someone over. The man in a black suit stepped up to her with a low voice, and the practiced composure of someone who makes problems disappear without sound. Mr. Michael DeLuca, the owner of the hotel, noticed you have been waiting quite a while. He would like to invite you upstairs to the penthouse for a glass of wine, if you wish. There is no obligation. You are absolutely free to decline. This is simply a courteous invitation. Ellie looked at this man, then at the card in his hand. Michael DeLuca, hotel owner. She looked back at her phone. A new message. Jess, traffic is a nightmare. Should I head home? So sorry, love you, Ellie. Ellie drew a long breath. Enough. She stood. I will go. If the guard was surprised, he did not show it. This way, please. And so she stepped into the private elevator, leaving the lobby where she had sat like a shadow for more than 1 hour, rising to the top floor, to the home of a stranger she had never met. It was a crazy thing to do, and she knew it. Yet perhaps, for the first time in years, she was choosing to do something entirely for herself. If you too have once sat waiting for someone beneath warm golden lights and understand the stunned stillness inside Ellie, please subscribe to our channel. Press like and share so we have more strength to keep telling the stories that land exactly where you recognize yourself. Turn on the notification bell so that every evening when the city softens, you have a new chapter to hear. And tell me where you are watching from by leaving the name of your city and country below so we know which little windows on the world map this small journey has reached. The elevator slid quietly toward the highest floors of the Belrose, while Ellie stood in silence beside the security guard. The glass wall returned her reflection, her hair still, rippling from the curl, her blue-gray eyes holding their sharpness thanks to careful makeup, yet within she could not deny the tangle of uncertainty. She was on her way to the penthouse of a man she had never met, a man known to her only by the name Michael DeLuca, the owner of this place. The guard had reassured her that the invitation carried no pressure, and that this was the first time his employer had ever made such an offer, but that did not lessen her confusion. She thought of the last message from Jess, and felt a familiar hollowness rise. This was not the first time and not the second. In recent months, Jess had been late again and again, even canceling at the final minute. And Ellie was always the one who said, "It is fine," always the one who waited and tried to be understanding and yielded. It had begun to drain her. The Belrose was not a place Ellie had ever imagined she would set foot in, much less sit for more than an hour in the lobby or ride an elevator up to the penthouse. Set in the old quarter of Tribeca, the building had been remade from a Beaux Arts structure raised in the early years of the 20th century. Outside, it still kept its pale limestone skin, its graceful dome, and the elaborate ornament that made passers-by turn their heads. Inside, everything had been lifted to another order entirely: marble floors imported from Italy, Persian rugs unrolling in long, quiet lanes, glass fixtures that shimmered like dawn dew on the branches. Every room at the Belrose was a piece of art, a living space designed with its own character, luxurious yet warm, modern yet faithful to an old soul. This was not a hotel for tourists. There were no suitcase wheels scraping, no people angling for a check-in photo. This was the preserve of the truly wealthy, those who did not need to flaunt anything and required silence, privacy, and absolute discretion. Ellie did not belong to that world. She knew it. She worked freelance in media. Enough to live and dress, decently, but not enough to order a glass of wine at this bar without glancing at the price in hesitation. When Jess asked her to meet here, Ellie hesitated. Jess said, "Go, it is beautiful there. Let us play Fiancée for a bit. We will drink martinis like in a movie and pretend to be rich. New Yorkers, it will be fun." Jess always persuaded that way, impulsive, enthusiastic, and somehow able to make a refusal feel unkind. Ellie nodded, not because she truly wanted to, but because she did not want to spoil Jess's excitement. She and Jess had been close since college, both studying communications at a small private school in Massachusetts. They had shared a freshman dorm room, survived all-night study sessions, the bleary mornings after parties, and the first breakups that felt like endings. When Ellie's mother died of cancer, it was Jess who gave up a summer internship to stay and care for her. Their friendship was bound not by perfect similarity, but by complement. Ellie was calm, planned, punctual. Jess was spontaneous and sunny, and at times careless, yet she always knew how to make Ellie laugh. The problem was that after 15 years of growing up, the distance between them was no longer a matter of temperament. Jess now seemed not to understand what Ellie needed, or worse, not to care enough to notice. Each time, Ellie said, "It is fine." When her friend arrived late, a small crack opened inside her. Still, she kept forgiving for the past, for the memories, for the habit. The elevator doors parted with a sigh and returned Ellie to the present. The corridor ahead glowed softly with patinated brass sconces, leading to a great door of walnut. The guard turned to her, his voice low and warm. "Mr. DeLuca is waiting in the sitting room. If at any moment you feel uncomfortable, simply say so and I will bring you down at once." Ellie nodded and tried to quiet the tremor in her chest. She did not know what waited beyond that door. She did know one thing with certainty: this time she would not wait for anyone. Not for Jess. Not for someone else's priorities. Not for the moment when someone finally treated her according to her worth. She would walk toward it herself, however risky it might be. The door opened without a sound, and Ellie stepped into a space that almost stole her breath. The penthouse was unlike any place she had ever seen. It was not glitter for show, but a quiet and costly refinement so precise that her senses paused. The ceiling rose high on dark beams. Glass ran from floor to sky, revealing a city glittering like an ocean of diamonds, and stone walls were punctuated with abstract paintings and hand-worked sculpture. The air carried that faint cedar, clean and expensive, yet it was not the room that made her heart trip. It was the man standing within it near a bar carved of onyx, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze resting on her as if he had been waiting. Michael DeLuca was not the kind of man she could easily forget, even after a single glance. Tall, spare, in a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, no tie, no jacket, only a natural ease held firmly in check. His black hair was slightly wavy, brushed back as if his hand had drifted through it without thinking, and somehow it settled perfectly, as if arranged for a magazine cover. His face was keenly cut, not soft yet not harsh, the kind of face that made you believe he had done hard things and never sidestepped the consequences. His eyes were black and deep, as if they could see through every layer of defense Ellie had built across her life. What surprised her most was not his appearance. It was the expression he wore, not the predatory or superior look she had feared. It was a small smile, almost gentle, touched with a hint of quiet amusement, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking and held no judgment at all. "You came," he said, his voice low with a trace of northeastern Italy, so soft it nearly dissolved into the air yet strong enough to stir her heart. "I was not sure you would say yes." Ellie swallowed and answered with a frankness she had not expected of herself in that moment. "I was not sure I would come, but here I am." He nodded and gestured toward the sitting area ahead, a long charcoal sofa, 2 classic armchairs, and a coffee table stacked with large books on photography, architecture, and the history of wine. "Please sit. What would you like to drink? I have wine, I have scotch, or anything you prefer. If I do not have it, I will find a way to have it. Red wine, if you have it, I have a few bottles. I hope my taste will suit you." He turned toward the small wine cabinet, his movements unhurried and sure, as if the whole evening belonged to him and nothing in the world required haste. While he poured, Ellie let her eyes travel the room. Nothing here felt staged. Everything seemed lived with, not merely displayed. The shelves showed the faint wear of books actually opened and read, not arranged into perfect lines. A laptop sat open. A coffee cup stood nearly empty. It all said one thing: Michael lived here not to put on a show, but because this was truly home. He returned and handed her a glass. Their fingers touched lightly, a brief contact that still sent a current along her spine. "Michael DeLuca," he said, his gaze holding hers. "Though I suppose you already know that." "Ellie Harper," she replied, working to keep her composure. "And I suspect you know that too." He smiled and set his glass down. "Then we are no longer strangers." She tasted the wine. It was soft and layered and deeply fragrant, certainly worth more than her rent this month. "I have only one question," she said, trying for a light tone. "Do you often invite strangers to your private apartment like this?" He tilted his head and did not hide his smile. "No. You are the first, and perhaps the last. I do not do things like this." "Then why invite me?" He looked at her and did not blink. "Because you had been sitting down there for nearly an hour and a half. Alone. Clearly you had been stood up, yet you did not make a scene, did not cry, did not leave. You simply sat, patient like someone on the edge of surrender. I found that interesting. And I thought perhaps you deserved to sit somewhere else, with someone who knows the worth of your time." Ellie said nothing because her heart was beating faster than she could master. Not because of flattery. Because his voice felt true, with no shell and no disguise, and in a fragile instant she wondered if this might be the beginning of something else. Something she had never imagined could happen, all because of one night, one hopeless wait, and an invitation that seemed reckless. Ellie set her wineglass down on the table with care, her heart still braided with doubt and curiosity, and she could not entirely believe what was happening. Since 1 hour earlier she had been sitting in a hotel lobby waiting for a friend and feeling abandoned for the umpteenth time, and now she was on the top floor of one of the most luxurious hotels in New York, facing a stranger who was at once compelling and dangerous in ways she could not name, while Michael did not hurry to fill the silence, which made Ellie feel he was well used to making people think more than they intended. And he sat back in the armchair opposite, one leg crossed, a glass in his hand, his gaze never leaving her for even a heartbeat, neither flirting nor tossing off small talk, simply looking as if he were reading each of her reactions and the smallest shifts in her breath, not with judgment but with an attentive certainty. And Ellie turned toward the glass wall where the city lights stretched to infinity like a living map and said, soft but not quite comfortable, "I did not imagine my evening would end this way." And Michael sipped his wine and said, "I did not imagine I would invite someone up here simply because I saw her stood up in the lobby, but sometimes the surprise is the best part of the day." A line that drew a faint smile from her, not because of the words themselves but because of the way he said them, light and almost offhand yet carrying something sincere. And she eased back into the sofa and began to relax, or at least pretended to, then asked whether he often watched guests in the lobby of his own hotel, and Michael answered, "No, that he suffered insomnia and liked to walk the property at night, not to supervise but to feel the space he was responsible for, that tonight he had passed the lobby and seen her, and he paused, his eyes deepening as if choosing his words with care, and said that she had sat like someone trying to hold steady while slowly cracking. That he did not know why, but he did not want to leave without doing something, and Ellie looked over at him and said, "So you sent someone to invite me to your apartment?" And he said he had told Marcus to make it clear it was only an invitation, and there was no pressure and that she was free to refuse. And she said, "But I did not refuse." And he nodded and said he respected the courage of that. And Ellie laughed softly, her head beginning to float a little, uncertain whether it was the wine or the unreality of the moment. And she said she was not sure it was courage, perhaps it was foolishness. And Michael leaned forward, his voice lower and warmer, and said perhaps, but foolishness is a wonderful thing when it makes a person stop waiting for what will never arrive. And Ellie fell quiet because the words struck the tenderest part of her, the place where she hid the exhaustion of too many waits and too many pardons and too many easy dismissals. And in that instant something inside her eased as if understood without explanation, and they kept talking, at first with distance, then slipping into currents of conversation that felt natural, while Michael avoided shallow questions and asked about her point of view and her feelings about this city and about her work and about the loneliness that hums under a metropolis that is forever in motion. And Ellie asked about him, not prying but showing she truly wanted to know why he lived above the hotel and why he was still single and how he could control so much and still appear unhurried. And he answered without evasion and without excess, always saying just enough to leave a seam of mystery, which only made Ellie more curious. And when the clock neared 1 o'clock in the morning, Ellie realized she had been there nearly 2 hours, and she took her last sip of wine and said, "I think I should go home." And Michael did not stand to stop her. He only said gently that if she did not want to leave just then, he had a guest room and she could stay. No pressure and no expectation, only an offer if she felt tired. And Ellie looked at him and saw no hidden suggestion, only courtesy, and something in his voice made her believe that at least in this penthouse, she was still the one in charge of her own choices. And she rested back against the sofa and breathed out and said, "I will think for a few more minutes." And Michael smiled and said that was fine and that he was not in a hurry. And there they sat, in a city that never sleeps, two strangers in a meeting that seemed accidental and was becoming exactly on time, while Ellie stayed on the wide, soft sofa, her fingertips tracing the rim of the empty glass, as she looked out at Manhattan glittering beyond the thick pane. And the air in the penthouse seemed to settle until there was only the city's distant breath and a ribbon of jazz as soft as silk slipping from speakers hidden in the walls. And Michael stood and reached to pour her another glass, but she shook her head and said, "If I drink more, I will fall asleep here," half in jest and half in truth. And he smiled and set the bottle down and asked whether she had eaten dinner. And Ellie frowned and reached back through the evening, then shook her head and said, "Not yet," that they had planned to eat at the bar but then Jess had. And she left the sentence unfinished, which was enough for Michael, and he walked toward the open kitchen, where warm light fell across the granite, and said he would not let her leave with an empty stomach, saying it with the firmness of a personal ethic. And Ellie called after him not to make it complicated and that she only needed something light. And he said not to worry, and that he was no professional chef but he had someone who could help. And he took out his phone and tapped a few keys and came back, saying his chef lived on the 4th floor, and he had messaged for a few simple dishes, and that if she did not like them, he would make pasta himself. And Ellie laughed and leaned back and said she would hold him to that. And he told her he was not joking, and that he had learned to cook from his grandmother when he was a boy, and that in Sicily, if a man could not make pasta, he was not considered a man. And about 15 minutes later, a silent cart rolled to the door with a simple and elegant menu: fresh pasta, with tomato and braised meat sauce, a small tray of antipasti, with cheeses and cured meats and olives and hot crisp garlic bread, and 2 plates of salad with olive oil fragrant with herbs. And they moved to the table by the window where the city unspooled like a carpet of light, and Michael drew out her chair, a small gesture full of respect, then sat across from her, and in the gentle light Ellie no longer felt as out of place as when she first crossed the threshold, as the initial distance between them seemed to dissolve, and they ate slowly and spoke of unimportant things, favorite dishes and old films, and the habit of staying up late. And Michael told her he had worked in Milan before returning to the United States to take over the hotel, And Ellie told him about the marketing campaigns she had run, and the odd clients who could make her laugh and cry in the same day. And he listened without interrupting, and without steering the story back to himself the way so many men she had known would. And every question he asked made her feel seen, not as a woman waiting in a lobby for a careless friend, but as a whole person with thoughts and worth. And when Ellie admitted she had once dreamed of opening her own creative studio, but had pulled back for financial reasons, Michael simply nodded and said that not everyone has the courage to pursue what they want, and that the fact she still kept that dream was already admirable, a sentence so plain it sank into her heart, since it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her like that, not with platitudes and not with airy cheer, but with recognition from someone who seemed to truly understand. And when dinner ended, neither of them stood, and the wine glasses had long been empty, and the city outside still burned bright, while inside the room the light had softened, and Michael braced his hands on the table and looked at her for a moment, and said slowly that he did not know what had made her say yes when Marcus brought the invitation, but that he was very glad she had chosen to come. And Ellie did not rush to answer, and looked into his eyes and saw something very real. Not exactly desire and not only curiosity but simple presence, which is rare in a world where everyone is busy and everyone waits for someone else to fill the spaces. And she said she thought she had simply been too tired to keep waiting. And Michael nodded as if he had known that answer already, and said, "Then today is my lucky day." And Ellie understood that this dinner had not only filled her stomach, it had quietly set the first stone for something larger that neither of them could yet name. When Ellie woke, morning light had slipped through the curtains and washed the elegant sitting room in gold, a room she vaguely remembered entering close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and the silk coverlet lay lightly over her, while the soft pillow cupped her neck so gently that it took a few seconds to realize she was no longer in her own small apartment. Then the memories of the night before rushed back like a film in reverse. The hotel lobby, the last message from Jess, the security guard, the elevator rising to the penthouse, Michael DeLuca, the glass of red wine, dinner with pasta, and the kinds of stories no one expects to share on a first meeting. And Ellie sat up, the brush of a silk nightdress against her skin, making her flush as she remembered she had changed clothes and yet could not recall exactly how. Only that Michael had politely pointed out the guest room and set down fresh towels and an unopened nightdress and left her alone, with no touch, no suggestive look, not a single step beyond the line, and she was used to men searching for reasons to close the distance. But last night Michael had not, and that, unexpectedly, made her trust him, and she stepped out with hair softly mussed and a bare face, feeling a little awkward walking through the home of a man she had met only the night before until the smell of fresh coffee from the kitchen loosened her, and Michael stood there in a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, his hair a little tousled, barefoot and still carrying that composed ease. And he heard her steps and turned with a smile and said good morning, and that he was not sure how she took her coffee, so he had brewed it black and she could add sugar or milk as she wished. And Ellie smiled with sleep still in her voice, and said that as long as there was caffeine she would not complain. And he handed her a cup and their hands brushed as they had the night before, but this time something warmer passed between them that was not only the heat of the porcelain, and they sat at the small table by the window while New York woke slowly under a veil of sunlight across the rooftops. And Ellie took the first sip and closed her eyes a moment and said, "He made better coffee than she expected." And Michael raised an eyebrow and teased whether he ought to be offended, and she said no and admitted she had assumed wealthy people let an assistant make their coffee, and he said he did have one, and then shrugged and said that this morning he wanted to do it himself, because he did not know when he would have the chance to make coffee for her again. And Ellie set the cup down and looked at him, and felt her heart stir at the simplicity of that line. Not a confession, only a quiet truth. And Michael leaned back and turned the cup lightly in his hands, and said that last night had not been planned, and that he had not intended to see anyone or invite anyone up, or share as much as he had, and that he was glad she had come, and if it did not feel too strange, he wanted to ask her to dinner. And Ellie was surprised not by the invitation, but by the clean way he said it without ceremony or games. And she asked if he meant a proper date, and Michael nodded without taking his eyes from her and said an evening at an ordinary restaurant, a place he loved, not the penthouse and not a chance encounter, because he wanted to know more about her, not because of a situation but because he was truly curious. And Ellie was quiet for a few beats, and then nodded and said yes, and that she wanted to know more about him too, but that he must not choose a place too grand, And Michael smiled in a way that eased her, and said he promised to choose a place where you did not need to shine a light to see the prices. And they laughed. And in that brief instant, Ellie knew she had stepped onto a new road, not planned, not controlled, and not one she wished to turn back from. And 2 days later, at exactly 7 o'clock in the evening, Ellie stepped from a taxi in front of a modest Italian restaurant, tucked into Midtown, where soft light spilled from large windows and calmed the street's quick pulse. And she wore a simple black dress with her hair loosely pinned and a touch of red lipstick to steady her confidence. And her heart beat fast, not from nerves but from the sense that she was entering something more important than an ordinary date. And Michael waited just inside near the host stand with that unmistakable presence, dressed in a black suit without a tie and a white shirt open at the collar, simple and elegant like his way of speaking. And when he saw her, he smiled and moved to open the door and offered his hand and said, "You are here, right on time, as you promised." And Ellie set her hand in his, and was a little surprised to hear him use the familiar you instead of the formal, and the space between them seemed to be closing faster than she had imagined. And they were led to a table in the far corner, where it was quiet under candlelight with a thin silk curtain that softened the room. And Ellie noticed they did not queue and did not wait, and the staff showed a particular respect, and she asked if he knew the owner. And Michael lifted his water glass with a small smile and said that he was the owner. And Ellie looked up with wide eyes and said, "Truly?" And he said yes, one of 3 restaurants he had invested in, but this was his favorite. With a chef who had worked in Milan and interiors he had helped shape detail by detail, not to show off but to create a place where people could sit and have a true dinner. And Ellie laughed softly and asked if this was the place where you did not need to shine a light to see the prices he had promised. And Michael tilted his head with a playful gleam and asked whether she was scolding him before she had seen the menu. And Ellie opened it and glanced at the prices and looked up, smiling, and said, "All right, you kept your word." And they ordered simply an antipasto, fresh pasta with truffle mushrooms for her, and a tagliata of beef with red wine for him. And yet the meal quickly became something more, as they talked, like people who had known each other longer than the calendar allowed, and as if the brief beginning had ceased to be a barrier. And Michael spoke of a childhood in Brooklyn, and of a father who died early, and a mother from Sicily who was iron-willed and full of love. And he spoke of growing up in a family where many things wore 2 faces, one public and lawful and one hidden, and of how living between those worlds demanded a sharper clarity than outsiders imagine. And he said he did not hide his past, and that if they kept seeing each other, she would in time see the darker corners he could not deny, and that he did not intend to excuse them. And Ellie fell still not from fear, but from the unvarnished honesty in his voice which asked her to weigh things genuinely. And rather than retreat, she felt herself step forward and said she did not need him to tell everything in one night. She only needed to know he would not lie. And Michael nodded slowly like a pledge, and said he would not lie to her. And after dinner they did not rush away and ordered 2 espressos, and lingered in the gentle gold light, and spoke about favorite books and failures, and the people they had loved and the wounds that still had not healed. And Ellie told him about being underestimated by clients, because she was a freelancer, and the nights of sleeplessness when she worried she was not good enough. And Michael listened without interrupting, and without turning the story toward himself, and he placed his hand on the table near hers without touching, and close enough for her to know he was there. And when they left the restaurant, the city was in full light, and Michael drove her to the door of her apartment in the West Village, and did not try to come in, and did not press. He only leaned and kissed her cheek and whispered, "Thank you for the evening," and that if she agreed, he wished to continue. And Ellie nodded, just a little, yet it was the surest nod she had ever offered a man, and she said she wanted that too. And when Michael turned away and stepped into the waiting black car, Ellie remained for a moment at her door, with her hand on the place where warmth still lingered on her cheek, and inside her something had changed, not exactly love, but certainly a beginning. 3 days after their evening at the restaurant, Ellie received a message from Michael at 8 in the evening. Only a few words. "If you have not had dinner, I have a special dish waiting." And she stared at the phone screen for a moment, with her heart beating fast for reasons she could not name. Not because she was surprised, but because the simplicity of the invitation carried a warmth that felt real, as if they had known each other longer than the calendar allowed. And she replied with a single word, "Yes," then quickly slipped into a soft dress, the color of pearl, brushed on a hint of blush, let her hair fall loose, and called a car to the Belrose, And when she stepped out of the elevator and reached the penthouse door, Michael was already there waiting. This time not in a shirt or a suit, but in a light gray crew-neck sweater and dark jeans, with his hair a little tousled as if he had just stepped from the shower. And he smiled when he saw her and said nothing beyond one simple line: "I am glad you came." And the penthouse held no candlelit glow or rose petals scattered like the scenes from romantic films Ellie had seen, only warm light from the ceiling, a small dining table laid with 2 neat place settings, and the scent of braised meat and toasted bread drifting from the kitchen. And Michael served the meal himself, poured the wine, drew out her chair, and Ellie realized those actions weighed more than any declaration, with no display and no reaching for effect, only presence that was honest and close. And they ate slowly and talked without a fixed thread, laughter woven with silences that were never awkward. And when the meal ended, Michael gathered the dishes and refused her help, and then invited her to the sofa where they had shared wine on the first night they met. And by then it was late, and the city outside had fallen to flickers of light and the sound of wind ribboning between the buildings, and Ellie tucked her legs under herself on the sofa, and turned toward him and traced the rim of her glass and said softly that she used to think relationships like this existed only in movies. Meeting someone in a way no one expects, and then feeling as if you had known each other before. And Michael was quiet for a moment, and set his glass down and leaned toward her, and said he had not expected it either, and that he had not planned for her, and yet she was here, and everything suddenly felt right. And Ellie could not tell who moved first, only that his breath was close enough to warm her skin, and then their mouths met without hurry or rush, and the first kiss was so gentle she wanted to cry. Not possession, but a question asked with patience and respect. And his hand found her back and drew her nearer without holding too tightly, touching her as if she might be hurt by force, as if she were something to be kept safe. And Ellie felt every beat in her chest and every quickened breath as his hand smoothed along her arm and then folded her into him. And she did not think or fear or analyze. She only knew that every sense in her turned toward the man before her, and they moved toward the bedroom without words, only eyes seeking and kisses that lengthened. And when Michael laid her on the bed and unfastened each layer of clothing with slow motions, Ellie felt not stripped but opened, as if old wounds were being touched with care. And he did not hurry, and he waited for her to lead. And when they came together, there was none of the frantic panting of hurried affairs. Only 2 people trying to speak to each other through skin and warmth and everything that words cannot carry. And afterward they lay still with breath that had not yet settled, and Ellie rested her head on his shoulder and drew lazy circles on his chest without speaking. And Michael drew the coverlet up around her and kissed her forehead and said that if she felt she needed to withdraw in the morning, he would understand, but that if she were still there when the sun rose, he would be grateful. And Ellie did not answer. She only held his hand more tightly, and in that instant she knew she did not want to withdraw, not in the morning and not on any other day, because she had chosen to stay with her whole heart. And the next morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains in light bands across the cream sheet, and Ellie woke in Michael's arms with her head resting on the warm flat of his shoulder and his breathing steady and deep, and she lay that way a little longer and felt an unfamiliar safety, as if the world outside had been kept at the door of this penthouse, until her phone vibrated on the bedside table and pulled her back with a string of client messages and a missed call from Jess that reminded her there was still a life beyond this room, with work and responsibility and questions without answers. And after she showered and dressed, she stepped into the living room where Michael stood on the phone, and the voice was lower and colder than she had heard the night before, with none of the softness. And he said he did not care about the excuse, and that the terms had been set, and that if the other man could not keep his commitment, then he could not keep protection. And there was a pause, and then Michael spoke again, quieter and no less firm, and said the man had 3 days to make it right, and after that it would be out of his hands. And Ellie stopped short with no intention of eavesdropping, and yet the door had been left almost closed, and the words carried clearly, and something in his tone gave her a chill, not because it threatened, but because it was so final and so different from the man who had kissed her gently the night before. And when he ended the call and turned and saw her, his eyes changed at once and softened as if he knew she had heard. And there was no dodging and no embarrassment, only quiet acknowledgement, and he asked if she had heard and stepped toward her, and Ellie nodded, without avoiding, and said she had not meant to listen, but the door was not fully shut, and Michael nodded and set the phone on the table and said he had guessed as much, and they were silent until Ellie spoke slowly and asked whether he had been threatening someone, and if this was the sort of protection racket she feared. And Michael looked directly into her eyes without retreat, and said he would not lie to her, and that parts of his work were not fully legal, and that his family from the earlier generation had operated in what people call the gray, not trafficking and not narcotics, but protection with fees and borders and their own rules, and that he had taken over after his father died and had chosen to clean it as much as he could, but that he had not walked away. And Ellie listened with her heart tightening as everything she felt about Michael, the sincerity and gentleness and reliable steadiness, braided with another face she had never expected to confront inside a relationship, and she asked whether what she saw, the hotel and the restaurants and the sheen of luxury, were tied to that darker side. And Michael stepped closer, and his voice deepened, and he said not all, that the hotel was legal, and the restaurants were as well, and that what he did in the other world he kept separate, and that he had principles, that he did not harm the innocent, and did not manipulate, and did not deceive, but that yes, there were moments he had to be hard as he had been that morning. And Ellie clenched her hands and felt her heart race out of rhythm, and asked when he had intended to tell her. And Michael met her gaze with grave steadiness, and no pleading, and only a cold, clear honesty, and said when she was ready to hear it, and when he knew she was not simply a strange knight, but that now the choice had been taken from him because she had heard and he would not deny it. And she looked at him a long time, and part of her wanted to leave and close this door and go back to the safe world where life stays predictable. But another part, the part that had trembled at his touch and laughed at his stories and looked into his eyes in candlelight, could not step back, and she said she was not afraid of his past, but she was afraid of not knowing where she stood. And Michael came closer, and his eyes gentled, and his hand brushed her cheek, and he said she stood in a place of choice, where no one would force her, and nothing would be hidden, and that he was not perfect, but that if she allowed it, he would always be a man who spoke truth to her. And a wave of feeling rose in Ellie, not because the words were sweet, but because she knew he was not practiced in such lines, and that they were not weapons but a rare opening, and it was that which kept her from turning away. And she whispered that she needed time, and Michael answered at once that he could wait as long as she still wished to stay. And Ellie did not answer immediately, but she did not leave, and she stood there in the quiet morning light, and understood for the first time that sometimes real feeling is not perfection. It is the courage to see the darkness in each other and still choose to remain. 2 days after that tense morning, Ellie had still not left Michael, not because she was being kept or had nowhere to go, but because she could not walk away while so much remained unsaid. She needed to understand, and to know the shape of the world the man she was beginning to love belonged to before her heart went too far to return. And on the afternoon of the 3rd day, they sat facing each other in a sun-washed sitting room, with no more evasion, as Michael had switched off his phone, and Ellie tucked her legs beneath her on the sofa with a pillow in her arms and her eyes steady on the man before her, and she said she did not want to live inside an illusion, and that she did not need him to be perfect, but she did need to know where his lines were. And Michael leaned back with his fingers laced and said he understood and that she had the right to know. And Ellie nodded and drew a long breath, and said she needed to know what made him draw those lines, and that he had said he would not harm the innocent, and asked what about those who were not innocent. And Michael was silent for a few beats before answering that he did not seek violence unless it was necessary, but that he belonged to a world where the law did not always move quickly enough, and where protection and control and keeping a balance sometimes required pressure, and that he was not proud of that, but he would not deny it. And Ellie rested her chin on her knees without looking away and asked whether he felt guilt, and Michael met her eyes with a strange calm and said, yes, but not for what he did, and rather for the world that made those things feel necessary. And that he did not want her to carry that part, and that he had tried to keep her at the edge because she was clearer and freer, and he did not want his darkness to drag her down. And Ellie smiled faintly with a sad curve, and said he was not pulling her down, and that she had stepped in herself and chosen to take the elevator to that penthouse, and chosen to stay after their first dinner, and chosen to sleep over, and that every step had been hers. And Michael bowed his head a little and said that if now she chose to leave, he would not stop her. And the sentence left Ellie quiet until at last she said that she was not sure she could live inside that world, but she was certain of one thing, that she trusted him, not because he spoke well, but because he had never forced her to believe. And Michael closed his eyes for a heartbeat as if holding something in place, and then came forward and lowered himself to his knees before her, and said he did not need her to accept everything he did, and only needed her to see him whole, and still want to stay. and Ellie bent to touch his face and said she had seen and she was here, and then whispered that she needed one thing, and Michael looked at her with hope opening and said anything. And she said truth. Always truth. Even when it is hard and tangled, and not to keep her outside. And that if she was part of his life, she needed to know the ground beneath her feet. And he nodded with grave sincerity and said he promised. And Ellie smiled and said, then she promised too, and that she would not run but would step in with eyes wide open. And Michael gathered her hands as if holding something more precious than any asset he owned. And in that moment they were not only two lovers, but two people standing before a choice and a truth and a future that would not be easy, but would be honest. And Ellie knew that if asked to choose between a perfect love built on pretense and a truthful love wrapped in complexity, she would always choose the latter. 1 week after that defining conversation, a fragile peace began to fray under an undertow that seemed at first unrelated to romance. And it began with an emergency meeting that pulled Michael away from breakfast with Ellie. And when he returned, he said nothing, and only held her longer than usual. Yet from his eyes she sensed something was badly wrong. And in the days that followed, he bent over his phone and laptop and left early and came home late, and the sleepless nights stretched on. And Ellie was no longer an outsider, and did not stand by the margins, but walked into the kitchen with 2 espressos near midnight, and set them beside him, and asked what was happening. And for the first time she saw his eyes lose their compass. And after a moment he answered in a worn voice that the Drake and Cole group was trying to buy the Belle Rose, and not in the ordinary way but with manipulation. And Ellie frowned and sat beside him and asked what he meant. And he said they were seeding rumors that the hotel was short of capital and riven by internal problems, and sending offers to small shareholders promising twice the value and buying silence piece by piece, and that he had discovered it only when his ownership fell below a controlling threshold without warning. And Ellie took his hand and felt his grip tighten until the knuckles blanched. And Michael DeLuca, the man who always commanded the moment, was facing a shape of crisis he had not calculated. And she asked about the board, and he said they were quiet, and that some had sold and others were waiting to see. And she asked if the takeover came, would they control the hotel? And he nodded with a hitch in his voice, and said they would turn it into a glossy, soulless branch, like any other, and that the Belle Rose name would be erased, and staff replaced, and everything he had built over nearly a decade wiped away. And Ellie squeezed his hand and said he was not alone and that she was there. And Michael gave a tired smile and said he had prepared for many things, competition, betrayal, even loss, but had never imagined sitting still as this place was swallowed while he was powerless. And Ellie said he was not powerless and that they would find a way. And Michael looked at her with gratitude threaded through fear, and she saw that he, a man who had never needed anyone and had never let anyone step into his weakness, was now letting her see. Letting Ellie look at a Michael who was not the proud master of an empire, but a man watching what he loved teeter on the edge of being stolen. And throughout that week he scarcely left the office on the top floor of the Belle Rose, while Ellie brought food and coffee and ideas, and understood that there were hours he had to face alone. And one evening as rain began to fall, she found him standing at the great window, looking down at the street, with his shirt creased and his tie slack, and she moved to his side and set a blanket over his shoulders, and he did not turn and teen, only whispered that he was afraid of losing it, and not for money, but because this place was his blood. And she rested her head against him, and answered that they would not let it go, and that she promised. And in the moment of Michael's weakness, Ellie set her first quiet step toward doing what even he had not yet dared to imagine, which was to fight not with force but with intellect and strategy, where she was stronger than anyone. The next morning, while Michael was still heavy with sleep after a tense night, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, a strong coffee in her hand and a sharpened gaze he had never seen before. And though she was neither a lawyer nor a shareholder, she was a communications specialist who had steered the image of brands teetering on collapse, and she understood that what Michael needed now was not power but public opinion. So she began by dissecting the quiet campaign of Drake and Cole, and spotted anonymous accounts that had been created less than 1 month earlier, flooding the same time slots with the same bleak rumors about the Belle Rose's finances. A dirty and disciplined operation, yet one with seams, and she built an emergency response dossier that never attacked Drake and Cole directly, but fixed the light on the hotel's legacy, a boutique icon of Manhattan braided into the cultural life of New York, a place that had welcomed important figures and private exhibitions and quiet gatherings no other address could host. and she wrote an article under the byline of an independent journalist known for covering architectural landmarks threatened by conglomerates, and she titled it, "The Belrose, the last jewel of Manhattan, stands on the brink of disappearance." And in fewer than 8 hours, the piece was shared thousands of times as artists, designers, and even famous guests spoke up, and hashtags like Save the Belrose and Belrose Legacy swept through social media. And Ellie did not stop there, as she invited leading architecture and culture magazines to visit, and staged an inside tour led by veteran staff, who shared untold stories from behind the scenes of a discreet yet emblematic hotel, so that every post and every image carried one clear charge. The Belrose is more than a hotel, it is a part of New York, and it must not be flattened into another soulless branch of Drake and Cole. And when Michael woke and found Ellie still at the screen with 4 half-drunk coffees and shadows under bright eyes, he came behind her and set his hand on her shoulder, and asked what she was doing in a rough, warm voice. And Ellie turned, with a dry-lipped smile, hair slightly wild, and said, striking back, not with lawyers but with a story. And Michael scanned the spreading posts, and the more he saw, the more astonishment gave way to something larger, which was trust. And he asked if she had set the public in motion, and she said she had not lied. She had simply reminded people of what they themselves had once felt about the Belrose, and had forgotten, and she reminded them why this place was singular. And Michael took her hand and kissed it with a breath of a voice, and said he had never known how much he needed her, and she answered that he did not have to know in advance. He only had to believe her when she said the Belrose would not be erased by those who worship only profit. And over the next 3 days, the stock of Drake and Cole dipped under the weight of the storm, and neutral shareholders at the Belrose began to hesitate, and some drifted back to Michael, fearing the brand risk of letting the takeover run further. And at a press conference, Ellie staged in the lobby where their fateful evening had begun. Michael DeLuca stood straight, eyed and clear, and declared, "The Belrose is not for sale. It belongs to New York, and we will do everything in our power to defend it." And Ellie watched from the wings, as the man she loved found the old light in his eyes, and she knew the war was not finished, yet they had won a decisive round, and most of all she had proved to Michael and to herself that real love is not only for the sweet hours, but for the courage to step into the squall and use your best gifts to guard what the other holds dear. The campaign did more than save the Belrose from a forced sale. It lifted the hotel to a new height in public esteem, as articles, backstage, videos, and testimonies from those bound to the place formed a swell of support that pushed Drake and Cole to retreat in silence to spare themselves further damage. And when the board finally met, Michael no longer entered as he had in the previous weeks, since he now carried the wind of public favor, returning shareholders, and above all Ellie, the woman who not only loved him but fought for him and for the thing he had tended. And the meeting closed with a near total result in Michael's favor, and he kept full control and rebuilt the internal frame by removing those who had sold quietly for personal gain. And when the decision became official, the press called it a triumphant counterstrike by a New York legacy. But for Michael, it all resolved to a single moment when he found Ellie sitting quietly in the little rooftop garden with her computer in her arms, and tired eyes still bright. And he came behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and whispered, "We did it." And Ellie leaned back against his chest and said soft, "I knew we would. I have always believed." And Michael turned her toward him with eyes that carried not only gratitude but something deeper, and said, "From today, the Belrose is not only mine, it is ours. And you are no longer outside, you are my partner. You are half of everything I have." And Ellie went still, not from surprise but from feeling, since she had dreamed of a simple love and a decent man, and had never imagined becoming part of something larger, not only in love but in the making and keeping of a legacy. And that evening, when the staff held a small celebration to thank the team's resolve, Michael lifted his glass and said, "I may be the legal owner, but the person who saved this place is Ellie, the woman who taught me that to love someone is not only to stand beside them, but to be ready to fight for them. And today I have kept my hotel, and I have found a companion, a partner, a person I cannot do without." And Ellie sat below with wet eyes and a tightened hand around her glass, and the applause rolled through the great hall. And yet the only sound that stayed with her was Michael's whisper as he sat beside her and took her hand and said, "From now on, I will make no decision without you. We are one team in work, in love, in everything." And Ellie smiled and gripped his hand and thought to herself that she did not only love a man named Michael DeLuca, she loved the world he carried, and now that world was hers too. 1 week after the victory at the Belrose, Michael turned to Ellie as they were eating breakfast in the penthouse kitchen and asked in a voice that felt at once casual and ceremonious, "Are you free this Sunday? My mother wants to meet you." And Ellie froze with her spoon suspended in midair, surprise and worry mingling in her eyes, because she had known this moment would come, yet hearing it from Michael with that calm that hinted at more made her heart race. "Meet your mother," she echoed, trying to sound composed even as her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. And Michael nodded with the faintest curve of a smile, as if he were quietly enjoying her small panic, and said not to worry, that it was only a family dinner and that his mother cooked beautifully but was very forthright. Would she be all right? And Ellie swallowed and nodded with brave cheer and said she would be fine, and that if she could handle a heavyweight media conglomerate, she would not let a single dinner unnerve her. And Michael laughed softly and set a hand on her shoulder and told her she was brave, but to remember this was not a job interview and to be herself, because that would be enough. Sunday arrived faster than Ellie expected, and she wore a modest cream dress with just enough makeup to honor the occasion without calling attention to herself. And Michael drove her to Brooklyn to a 3-story Italianate house, where the DeLuca family had lived for 3 generations. And the moment she stepped inside, she was met by laughter, and the patter of children, and the warm scent of tomato sauce and garlic drifting from the kitchen. A home soaked in kinship and noise in the best Italian way. And Michael said, "Mother, this is Ellie," with his palm resting lightly at the small of her back like a quiet reassurance. And Rosa DeLuca came out of the kitchen with her apron still on, and a sharp gaze that swept Ellie from head to toe, and she did not speak at once, only looked closely, and then smiled the smallest smile, and said at last, "I finally get to meet the person who stopped my son from staying up all night with work." And Ellie smiled, and offered her hand, and said she was very happy to meet her and thanked her for the invitation. And Rosa did not shake hands but stepped in to kiss both of Ellie's cheeks in the old way, and said gently, "Come help me in the kitchen and let the men set the table," a sentence that landed like a soft command. And Ellie glanced at Michael, and he only winked as if to say good luck. In the kitchen, Rosa handed Ellie a towel and showed her how to roll the lasagna and how to test the sauce. And now and then Rosa watched Ellie while posing questions that sounded light yet went straight to the heart. "Where is your family? What did you do before you met Michael? Do you visit your parents often?" And Ellie answered each one honestly and briefly without trying to dazzle, knowing Rosa did not need showmanship but wanted sincerity. As they were laying out the plates, Rosa stopped and looked directly into Ellie's eyes and asked, "Do you know what my son does?" And Ellie did not blink, and answered softly and firmly, "I know, and I have chosen to stay. Not because of that, but because of who he is. Michael is a decent man, and I trust that he lives by his own principles, even inside an imperfect world." And Rosa was quiet for a few beats and then nodded, and her gaze softened. "Good, because if you did not know, I would tell you, this family hides nothing. And if you do know and are still here, that says a great deal." Dinner was noisy and full of laughter and teasing. Michael's brothers took turns tossing Ellie impossible questions. The children ran circles around the chairs. And now and then Rosa studied Ellie with a weighing look that no longer felt like scrutiny. And when the meal ended, Ellie helped clear and then returned to the living room to find Rosa waiting in the hall. And Rosa stepped forward and took Ellie's hand for the first time with a true gentleness and said, "You did very well today, and I believe you will do even better when you become part of this family. Welcome, Ellie." And Ellie had no words as her worry melted in a single sentence. On the drive back, Michael turned with a bright smile and said, "I told you so. You won over my mother. No one escapes you." And Ellie laughed and squeezed his hand and said, "She simply does not quit easily, especially when she believes something is worth keeping." That night after leaving Rosa's house, Ellie still carried with her the aftertaste of the first true family meal she had experienced in years while living inside a crowded yet lonely city. A warmth of space, and the lively braid of voices, and the attentive looks of people who until then had been only names in Michael's stories, all of it making her feel genuinely welcomed. And on the drive home, Michael did not turn on music as he usually did, and the car slid quietly through streets, already jeweled with light, in a city radiant, yet strangely calm, while he drove with one hand, and with the other held hers, the pad of his thumb tracing the back of her hand as if to keep her very close, not only in distance but in feeling. And when the car stopped before the Belrose, he did not cut the engine, but turned to her with eyes more pensive than usual, and a low voice carrying a rare hesitation, and said, "I know this may not be the right moment, but there is something I want to say to you, not with a ring or a romantic dinner, but simply now here." And Ellie turned slightly and waited, with her heart slowing as if to catch every word. And Michael drew a long breath and said, "From the first night I saw you in the lobby, I thought you were different, but I did not know you would change my life from the way I work to the way I love someone. You have stood beside me in the quiet days, and you have fought with me in the storm, and tonight, watching you smile at my mother and talk with my brothers and carry the plates, I know something more surely than ever. Ellie Harper, I want to marry you." And the words were light as air and woke everything inside her, so that she looked at him with brightening eyes and pressed her lips together to keep from crying in a moment so unguarded. And he added with a small smile that he had no ring and nothing prepared, but that this was his promise, and that one day soon, when she was ready, he would kneel before her properly, with a ring worthy of her, and ask her as she deserved to be asked, but that right now he wanted her to know that in his heart she was the only person he wished to walk the rest of his life with. And Ellie nodded, and could no longer hold back tears, and she squeezed his hand and smiled through them and said, "Then let this be my promise in return. I will be here with you until the day you keep yours." And Michael leaned and kissed her forehead for a long time, as if each breath could etch the instant into memory. And there were no rings or flowers or candles or orchestra, only a quiet evening in a car parked beneath the building. They called home, and the simplest, most complete promise they had ever given each other. And when they stepped into the lobby, the receptionist greeted them with a warm smile, and the guard opened the glass door to the private elevator, and Ellie rested her head on Michael's shoulder as they rose to the highest floor, where the night sky stretched ahead like black velvet, scattered with glitter. And there, in the apartment that had once belonged only to Michael and was now theirs, they cooked a light supper, opened wine, played jazz, and sat close by the window with few words, while the whole space seemed to hum the same whisper that they belonged to each other in a way more certain and more beautiful than any formal vow. And 1 month after that tender evening, everything seemed to shift forward, softly yet clearly, as Ellie and Michael lived together like a couple, long married without display or flourish, and with deep sharing and accord in mornings, beginning in laughter and evenings ending in an embrace so familiar that Ellie sometimes forgot they had known each other less than a year. And still Michael did not return to the promise he had made, with no hints and no teasing clues of a day to come. And Ellie did not ask and trusted him the way one trusts the sun to rise after night, without knowing the exact minute, until a Friday when Michael texted her to come home earlier than usual without explanation. And when she returned to the Belrose, the private elevator had already been keyed for the roof instead of the penthouse, and her heart pounded and her hand trembled slightly as a strange certainty swelled inside her, both eager and afraid to hope too much. And the doors opened onto a rooftop transformed, with warm golden lights strung like falling stars, and hundreds of small candles tracing a long path toward a setting arranged like a private feast, with a long wooden table draped in white, linen crystal glasses gleaming fresh flowers in a gentle palette, and beyond them, the Manhattan horizon blazing in the night. And all of it faded when she saw Michael standing at the end of the path in a classic black suit, without a tie, in a white shirt with sleeves turned back, a small navy box in his hand, and the look of a man for whom the world had gone. Still, and Ellie walked toward him in light steps, while her heart seemed to burst, and when she reached him, he smiled and held out his hand and said softly, "I thought I had prepared for this all my life, yet when you stepped from the elevator, my heart still raced like the first time I saw you." And she could only grip his hand and feel the steady warmth she knew so well, as he knelt and opened the box to a sapphire ring, the blue of deep water circled by 2 rows of small diamonds, elegant and restrained and very much like her. And he looked up and said, in a voice quiet and sure, "Ellie Harper, on the first night we met, you were waiting for someone who never came, and you sat alone in the lobby with a patience so quiet I had never seen. And I thought then that whoever made you wait like that did not deserve you, and I promised myself that if you agreed to step into my world, I would never make you wait again for anything. So I am here to keep that promise. Let me be the last person you ever have to wait for, the one who arrives on time, the one who always stands where you need me. Let me make sure that, from this day, you will never again sit by yourself in any lobby. Ellie, will you marry me?" And tears slid down Ellie's cheeks before she knew it, and she nodded with a hand over her mouth and said through a broken breath, "Yes, yes, I do. And I would say yes 1,000 times more." And Michael rose, and with slightly shaking hands, slipped the ring onto her finger, and when it settled against her skin, he drew her into his arms as if he would never release her. And behind them, a small orchestra lifted the melody of an old love song and fireworks bloomed above the city, and Ellie leaned against his shoulder and whispered, "I never thought I could love someone this quickly, but you, Michael DeLuca, broke every rule inside me." And he smiled and tightened his arm and said, "I did not need to break anything. I only needed you to see me at the moment you needed, and I was lucky you did not walk away that night." And Ellie laughed with eyes still bright and said, "Lucky you sent someone to gather me up," and he corrected her with a kiss to her temple and said, "Lucky you chose to follow a stranger because that reckless choice brought you to me, and I will be grateful for it all my life." And on that rooftop beneath the lights and the fireworks in each other's arms, they needed no further promises because the look, the embrace, and the quiet line, "Let me make sure you never wait," were the most beautiful vow for a life joined without end. News of the engagement between Michael DeLuca and Ellie Harper moved through Manhattan like a warm wind, not because it was splashed across newspapers or boasted on social media, but because everyone around them, from family to the staff at the Belrose to their closest friends, felt that something sacred was blooming between these two. A love that needed no noise yet ran so deep it made anyone who witnessed it smile. And Ellie threw herself into wedding preparations with eagerness laced with nerves, since although she had helped clients stage events large and small, this was the first time she was preparing for herself for the most important day of her life, while Michael leaned the other way and wanted to simplify everything as much as possible, because for him, if the person beside him at the altar was Ellie, then the rest could be left to whatever may be. And Ellie knew that deep in the heart of a man who usually controlled every detail, the act of handing decisions to her was itself a profound expression of love. And they chose to marry on the very rooftop where Michael had proposed on a late autumn afternoon, when the air would not yet be too cold and the sunset would bathe the city in gold. And Rosa, Michael's mother, took charge of the food with the enthusiastic help of the sisters-in-law. And Ellie laughed when she realized she did not need to hire a wedding planner, because her future mother-in-law carried enough coordinating energy for an entire crew. And Jess would of course be maid of honor, and though busy, she gave whole weekends to dress, hunting flower colors and invitations. And at one fitting, Jess hugged Ellie hard and said, "You know, I used to be afraid you would always stay with people who never arrived on time. People who did not see your worth, but look at you now, radiant. Happy and loved the way you always deserved." And Ellie said nothing, only tightened her friend's hand, knowing any words of thanks would be redundant. And Michael hovered quietly behind every decision, sometimes offering a gentle opinion like, "I think a Tuscan red over a Bordeaux," or "Do you feel lavender fits a sunset ceremony?" And most of the time simply watched and smiled as the woman he to love turned her dream into the world. And what moved Ellie most was how Michael found time to call and handwrite invitations to her old friends, the ones she thought life had swept away. So that messages came from a college friend, a former colleague, even a professor who had advised her thesis, each saying how glad they were to be invited to her day. And when she asked how he gathered those addresses, he only shrugged and said, "You are the most important person in my life, and those who were once important to you, I want them there." And the string of preparations rolled on. Not without pressure or fatigue yet. Whenever Ellie felt overwhelmed, Michael was there to walk her through the park at dawn, to brew coffee exactly as she liked, or simply to pull her into his arms and let her rest her head and breathe out the tangles. And one night before the final rehearsal, they stood on the rooftop while the last details were being arranged, and Michael set his hand on her waist and whispered, "I wish not only for tomorrow to be perfect, but for all the life that follows," and asked, "Are you ready, Ellie Harper, to become Ellie DeLuca?" And Ellie nodded with eyes bright under the lights and said, "I have been ready since the first time you promised to be the last person I ever have to wait for and everything after. That is just a gift." And they kissed, softly and deeply, like a final assent before stepping into a new chapter. And that afternoon, Manhattan was washed in slow honey light, as if the city knew this day was special, and the rooftop of the Belrose, where a quiet, stirring proposal had once unfolded, now shone with hundreds of candles, white flowers laced with pale lavender and strings of lights like a sky of stars, as the closest people gathered with no one missing and no one late, as if the universe had decided to set every clock right for Ellie Harper and Michael DeLuca. And Ellie walked between two rows of white chairs on the arm of her father, in a soft gown that graced a small frame full of confidence, with her eyes fixed only on Michael, waiting at the end of the aisle, his face so tender one could forget. He had been a name to reckon with, and here in this moment, he was not a hotel owner or an heir to a powerful family, but a man ready to be called the husband of the woman he loved. And when her hand was placed in his, he kissed the back of it as if he could not quite believe she stood here about to become his wife. And they exchanged simple vows without ornate promises, only sincerity, as Michael pledged he would always arrive on time, be the first to come when she needed, and the last to leave if her heart faltered. And Ellie smiled with wet eyes, and answered that she did not need a perfect life, only a companion who would never leave her to wait in uncertainty. And the applause rose as they were pronounced husband and wife, and their first married kiss sent cheers and happy tears through the crowd. And the reception followed on the same rooftop as twilight surrendered to night, while glasses filled with wine and a small orchestra played, and Jess stood with a microphone and eyes bright with joy and pride, and lifted her glass and said, "I was the one who made Ellie wait many times too many, and she always forgave, always said it was fine, always understood others, and forgot herself. Until one night when I was late again, something miraculous happened. She stopped waiting for me, and chose to follow a strange invitation. A choice I thought was madness, but from here I see it was her bravest decision." And Jess looked at Ellie through a shimmer of tears and said, "You taught me the worth of a self, and Michael, you are the gift the universe sent at the right time to the right person. You did not just arrive on time. You stayed, you were patient, and you made my best friend shine in a way I have never seen. So thank you and promise you will go on, being the man who never makes Ellie wait, not only in minutes but in every moment of life, because she deserves to be loved like that every day." And Jess lifted her glass higher and said, "For Ellie and Michael, for a love that comes on time, for a woman who once sat alone in a lobby, and a man who saw her in a crowd, may you always be each other's destination, whatever life may change." And the space seemed to catch its breath, then burst into clinking glasses, applause, and music, as Michael tightened Ellie's hand beneath the table and whispered, "I will never make you wait, not now, not ever." And Ellie looked at him with a smile both full and trembling and said, "I know, because since you appeared I have not felt alone even once." And they stepped onto the floor and turned amid the golden lights, the blessings and the people they loved, opening a chapter with no more solitary waits, only moments held together without letting go. After the wedding, when the last notes of music drifted away, and the warm gold lights on, the Belrose rooftop softened into velvet ribbons, Michael gently tightened his hand around Ellie's and whispered something at her ear that only the two of them could hear. And she nodded with eyes full of happiness and trust, and they slipped away from the celebration without announcements or farewells, leaving only quick embraces and the glow of well wishes in the faces of those they loved. And the private elevator carried them to the highest floor, where everything had begun, and a penthouse that had once been a strange space. A destination born of a reckless choice had become a home. And when the door opened, the familiar fragrance of cedar and lavender greeted them like a ritual, and it was no longer the quarters of a powerful man living alone, because the air now held Ellie's breath everywhere, with a scatter of books on the coffee table, her favorite robe hanging from the sofa, a photograph of the two of them on the bookshelf by the window, and Michael did not turn on the bright lights but drew the great curtain aside so the city could wash in, and lay soft bars of light across the wood and glass, and she stood there in a white gown with hair falling like waves and eyes following him as if she still could not believe any of this was real. And he came to her and lifted the veil from her hair with hands so careful it seemed each motion had been planned never to disturb a single thread, and Ellie tipped her face to him and asked, in a whisper, "We are truly married, are we not?" And Michael smiled and set his brow to hers and said, "Yes, you are my wife, the wife of Michael DeLuca, from today and for always." And she laughed softly with a tremor of feeling and said she liked how he spoke it like a vow. And he answered, "Because it is a vow," then lifted her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever touched, and carried her to the bedroom where roses lay across the wide bed, and candles cast little constellations upon the ceiling. And they said nothing more, because there was no need, and everything was clear in their eyes and in their hearts. And Michael undressed Ellie piece by piece, as if opening something sacred, and she stepped out of her last inner armor, and the night was not discovery, but return, a return to the warmest, safest place, and they made love without hurry, and not with the urgency of a first time, but with gentleness and understanding, each touch a thank you, each embrace an affirmation that they belonged to one another. And afterward Ellie rested with her head on his arm, hair tousled along her shoulder, and her eyes half closed in the afterglow, and Michael kissed her forehead and murmured, "The first time you came here, you thought I was 80, and Ellie laughed with her eyes still shut, said she had in fact hoped he would be 80, because at least 80 would not make her heart race so wildly. And he laughed and drew her closer and said, "But you came, and you chose to stay, and I still cannot believe you are real." And she lifted her gaze and said, "I am real, Michael, and you are where I have chosen to stop." And outside Manhattan glittered like an endless blessing, and in a penthouse that was now a nest, two people, once strangers, once living in separate worlds, lay, folded into each other's warmth and light, beginning a new chapter no longer marked by solitary waits, but by the shared writing of a love story that had started with what seemed a wild decision to follow a stranger to a penthouse and turned out to be the most beautiful risk of their lives. On a quiet autumn afternoon upon the Belrose rooftop, Ellie and Michael sat side by side on a long bench by the rail, with fingers linked watching Manhattan burn bright under gentle gold, and they were no longer the two wary souls of 8 months earlier with cautious questions and blurred boundaries, because now they were husband and wife, companions in a life, two spirits who had found one another among millions. And when an old friend of Michael's visited and saw them, he asked, half teasing, "How did you two even meet? It looks like a film." And Ellie laughed and turned to her husband with a playful light in her eyes and said, "You tell it, I have told it too many times." And Michael shook his head, smiling, lifted her hand and kissed the back of it, and began in that low voice of his. She sat in the lobby for over an hour waiting for a friend who never came, and I saw her from above on the security feed, a quiet, patient, beautiful woman, with hope slipping from her eyes, and I did what I had. I'm never done in my life. I asked my guard to invite her up for a glass of wine to the penthouse, and she should have refused, and Ellie cut in with a soft laugh. But I did not refuse. I sent my friend a message, said something urgent had come up, and I left first, and I did the most foolish thing I had ever done. I went up to a stranger's room, and Michael gave her hand a small press and said, "And it was the finest decision you ever made." And Ellie nodded with her voice turning tender, and said I was tired of waiting for others, waiting for care, waiting for apologies, waiting for someone to place me where I belonged. And that day, for the first time, I chose not to wait, and by some grace I walked into the place I was meant to be. And they fell quiet for a few minutes, watching the city turn under the same sunset where everything had started. And the story of Ellie and Michael was no fairy tale, with magic wands or dramatic rescues, but a story of choices, the choice to trust among 1,000 doubts, to stay when leaving would have been easy, to face truth rather than dodge it, to choose love over safety, and above all it was a story of courage, the courage to step outside the circle of comfort, to love a person with all their shadows, and to I believe you deserve something better, and this story may mirror no one else's life, and still it touches something in every heart, because who among us has not waited once for someone, not longed to be seen and chosen, not hoped for a person to enter our life with sincerity and resolve? And if you are watching this and feel the story land inside you, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share it with those you love, so we can spread the worth of brave choices and truthful love. And tell us what you think about the journey of Ellie and Michael, and whether you have lived a moment that altered everything the way it did for them. And leave a comment below, and share the honest feeling that rises from your heart, because we listen to every story with respect and gratitude. And thank you for walking with us through today's tale, and may your days be full of love, and your body be strong, and your spirit at peace, and may you always trust that good things are on their way, and we will see you in the next video with more stories to move you. And for now, goodbye, and may your life be truly happy.